Today was Friday, the preparation day. But for me, it was like the first day of my new life. Today I went public as a follower of Jesus the Messiah, the only Messiah, the Son of God, the creator and sustainer of all life, the one whose Father sent him to earth to find me, Nicodemus, Pharisee, member of the Sanhedrin, lost sinner, needing to be found. Early this morning, I learned that the high priest had called a nighttime meeting of the Sanhedrin, an illegal meeting, and it was more than just calling the assembly at night. He also left two of us off the list of invitees, myself and Joseph of Arimathea. Both of us have questioned our leader's attitude toward Jesus. Both Annas and Caiaphas hate him so much that sometimes I think they fear he has come to steal their own priestly robes. It's a violent hatred, one that often boils with malice worthy of a Roman centurion in a battle with a gladiator. I was there one day in the court of the temple when Jesus came in, saw what was happening, the money changers, the sellers of sheep, the sellers of this and that and everything else. Jesus' fury was unbelievable. He reached down and found a bunch of cords, picked them up, and in the next few minutes, he absolutely chased everyone. Well, all the salespeople and thieves out of the court of the temple. He looked at Annas and Caiaphas and Malchus and the others and said, "You have turned my father's house into a den of thieves." Maybe that's part of why they hate him so much. The nighttime meeting of the Sanhedrin was all about Jesus. Malchus, the high priest's advisor, had bribed a man from Jesus' inner circle, one Judas Iscariot, a lover of silver, gold, and power, they say, to betray his master as a criminal who blasphemes Yahweh. Judas kissed him in Gethsemane, right near the place where I had found him on that night 2 years ago. That brought Malchus and the temple guard racing from the shadows. And one of the Galileans, they say, flung his sword in protection and sliced an ear off the old conniver Malchus. At first I thought that was truly funny. Old Malchus is worse than Ahithophel was in the palace of King David. Smart, sly, cunning, and slippery. Well, obviously, Jesus disagreed with my assessment, for he reached down, found the severed ear, brushed off the dirt and blood, and reattached it to the demon's head. I would have cut off the other ear also. Not Jesus. The love he described to me cuts through even the ugliest of his enemies. Imagine placing his messianic hand on that quivering, filthy flesh and then putting it back in the rightful place on his most dangerous enemy. Only love would do that. The Sanhedrin, short two of its most vocal members, condemned Jesus to death and took him over to Pilate's judgment hall so Caesar's hand could sign the decree. Somehow, King Herod also managed to get into the act. Not sure of all the details about how that happened, but I caught up with the day just as Pilate was washing his hands and the people were screaming for blood. Crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. It's a chant that will last in my mind forever. Even though that chant was started by ruffians hired by Malchus, it quickly swelled into a roar of hatred. A hatred so hot that I felt the fires of hell scorching the air. A demonic spirit took over the people of Jerusalem that day, and it had all gone too far for either Joseph or me to have any impact on what was happening. We met beside a vegetable stand. "I have a tomb," Joseph whispered. "I have one also," I responded. "Yes, Nicodemus, but mine is closer to Golgotha, where he will be crucified." I can get to Pilate and I will ask permission to place the body of Jesus in the sepulchre of Arimathea. See what you can do about spices. I ran, fleeing through several back alleys, searching for spices and oils worthy of embalming a Messiah. Jesus would deserve the best. Running, for an old man like me, was a chore beyond pain, especially in the mortuary district, where tiny streets curl around vats of boiling messes that just pound your head with the smell of death. It was not something I want to do again. I have never dealt closely with death and had no idea what spices to buy or how much. An ancient woman attending one of the shops said, "Who died?" I told her that God was about to die and deserved the finest burial since King David. She laughed at my pain and suggested myrrh, aloes, nard, and a variety of other expensive embalming spices that would be necessary. About 30 pounds heavy, she said. You'll especially need spikenard. If it's a king who's dying, then nard it is. Did you know, man? King David sprinkled spikenard on his beard 3 or 4 times each day. It's definitely the spice of a king, a fragrance that speaks royalty and promises new life. I ordered 75 pounds, and she filled a bag till it overflowed. And then she added several long strips of white linen grave cloth, tied it all off, charged me enough money to rebuild a temple for Jesus, the one who taught me about love, the king who came all the way to Jerusalem to find me. It was enough. I would have paid double if she'd asked. The bag felt like feathers on my shoulder as I sprinted around the corners, back down the steps, through the gate, into the Kidron Valley, up the steep cliff toward Golgotha, shoving aside bloodthirsty Passover mobs as I ran. The quake came long before I topped the hill, rattling my knees and collapsing me onto the stones. By the time I got to the crosses, it was over. Joseph was there, arguing with a distraught centurion. The terrified soldier finally accepted the writ from Pilate as genuine and shouted for several of his soldiers to get the dead king down and give him to this man and his friend. I will be forever haunted by the centurion's eyes. They were wide, staring, trembling. He looked as if he had been staring God in the face and kept mumbling that maybe he'd killed the wrong man. They dropped his body beside us and sprinted home toward their garrison. His hands were mangled, beaten and broken and caked with blood. The hands that had calmed storms and raised the dead were now hardly even recognizable as human. His feet were the same, purple, swollen from the weight of his crucified body, punctured and torn, twisted. Feet that had walked in the Jordan with John the Baptizer. Feet that stood toe-to-toe with scribes and lawyers. Feet that had been washed by Mary's spikenard. Now crushed, cold. What can I say about his body? Naked, stripped of all dignity, now just human, empty of breath like all of us will one day become. Eyes without light, dark. God's Son in shredded skin. Joseph and I wrapped him gently in the strips of linen the old woman had provided. We'd never done anything like this before, and we found it difficult to wrap the body and the spices together, but finally we succeeded. And then we, Joseph and I, lifted the weight of the Messiah in our arms and carried him to the sepulchre of Arimathea. It was late. Sabbath had already arrived. Impossible for us to complete the embalming process in a legal and appropriate manner. So we laid him in the empty niche, on the stone slab Joseph had purchased for himself. We made sure the spices were placed safely, walked outside, slid the stone door closed, and then we came home to wait for the day after Sabbath when we could complete our task. What more can I say? He came to find me. I let him die. Today, the Messiah was destroyed by those who hate love. There is weeping in heaven and cheering in hell. Yet in the tomb, even as my arms laid his broken body on the stone slab, I felt a stirring of hope in my chest. Jesus spoke often of his own coming death. Sacrifice, he called it. But he never spoke of it with fear. Maybe Jesus saw death as the beginning of new life, as the ushering in of something wondrous, something better, far better, something everlasting. Probably I should take a warm bath. I should actually just go to bed, but my racing mind has no brakes. Besides, there remains an enchanting fragrance of unused spikenard, the fragrance of royalty. Sabbath. Probably the longest Sabbath of my life, ever. And also, strangely, one of the most peaceful. My body would not accept sleep last night, so I kept reviewing every moment of Friday, frantic at times, hoping I could find something I could have done, should have done, so that Jesus, the Messiah, would still be alive. But I found nothing for which to feel guilty, and yet much for which to feel sad. I should have stood up earlier. I should have let the entire Sanhedrin know how I really felt about Jesus. Yet, even though I wish that I could have spoken forcibly long ago, I know that any speaking I would have done would simply have sealed my own fate without affecting his. Something about his death felt foreordained, almost expected and unavoidable. I pulled out many of the scrolls last night and read most of Jeremiah, several of the Psalms, and all of Isaiah by the light of my candles. He had often referred to these prophecies. Many times it seemed as if he believed they had actually been written about him, personally, by name. I found the Messianic prophecies again last night and read them to myself. All of them, again and again and again. He was despised and rejected of men. A man of sorrows, rejected, oppressed, afflicted. Yet he opened not his mouth. I can count all of my bones. People stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them and cast lots for my clothing. And then I went back and I reviewed all of my own notes, my careful recounting of what I had heard about Jesus, what he'd said about himself, and what others, both friends and enemies, have said about him. As I read, I was struck by three things. Jesus spoke often of how the Messiah would experience pain, persecution, and even death. But whenever he spoke of the pain and death, he always spoke of resurrection. Jesus was not afraid of death. In fact, he promised to face it with calm silence, like a sheep before its shearers. Several times he said that he had the power to rise again if someone killed him. Everyone laughed when he said that. I didn't laugh last night. Because the third thing I noticed is that Jesus clearly said he would take up his life again on the third day. Early this morning, I received a message from one of my friends. The high priests have demanded that Pilate place 100 Roman soldiers in front of Joseph's tomb, band the stone door, and seal it with the hand of Caesar. Seems like the high priest may have been reading the same scriptures I did last night. I was excited by the discovery, desperate to run to the disciples and tell them what I'd learned, to see if they were still in mourning, or maybe to join them in celebrating a resurrection. But I could not go. The disciples did not yet know that I had purchased embalming spices for the body. They did not know me as a believing friend. They knew me as a Pharisee, a member of the Sanhedrin, a wealthy ruler who asked many questions but did not openly follow their master. If I tried to talk to them now, they would assume that I was coming as a spy for the priests, one who could not be trusted. They would not let me in. They would not listen. So I stayed home, safe from old enemies and new friends. And I spent all day thinking about Jesus. Possibly, I was preparing to celebrate a resurrection. Another Messiah, Caiaphas had told me as we walked in the temple about 3 years ago. This one comes from Nazareth of all places, though of course they say he was born in Bethlehem, like all Messiahs are born in Bethlehem. I wonder if a real Messiah will ever come. And Caiaphas traipsed off toward his quarters. I checked out all the Messiahs, the ones who came with swords, the ones who came as thieves, the pietists and the preachers, the anti-Roman nationalists. I followed them all, one by one, hoping I would find a real Messiah. But each time, it became obvious that this one too was a fraud, fake, a charlatan. There were a few who actually believed, I am the promised one. But most just pretended, for the fame or for the money. None, none had come from Nazareth. I found him in Gethsemane, in the garden that has been taken over by the homeless rabble of our day. He and a score or more of his followers, disciples he called them, were camped near one of the stone barriers, one that offered safe shelter for fires. One has to be warm, and so does the food, they laugh. My questions had been carefully crafted to match the record this Christ had made so far in his messianic career. Water to wine, blind given sight, broken hands straightened, demons dispersed. Most of them were medical miracles that could be staged, though some of the stories blended a bit with the impossible. I wondered if some of the miracles might actually be true. John, a disciple with the rough hands and dress of a Galilean fisherman, introduced us. Nicodemus, he said, from the Sanhedrin. Jesus stood, and I spoke my carefully prepared questions. Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher who has come from God, For no one could perform the signs you are doing if God were not with him." I paused for a breath, and he interrupted, speaking calmly as if I had said nothing at all. "Very truly, I tell you, no one can see the kingdom of God unless they are born again." The ensuing argument lasted many minutes. Nicodemus accusing Jesus of not knowing how births take place, and Jesus speaking to me about birthing by water and birthing by wind. None of it made any sense at all. This Messiah was not just a fraud, he was crazy. I stopped him, right in the midst of all of his crazy explanation about wind. "Sir," I asked, "why are you here?" And then he turned my life upside down. "Nick," the Messiah reached out and placed his carpenter's hand on my shoulder. "My Father loves you so much that he sent me down here to find you, to answer your questions, to hold you close, to bring you home, so that rather than dying down here, you can live with us in our home forever. I came to bring you home." He said it seriously, as if recalling a special memory with his dad, a moment that was now being fulfilled in the homeless camp in the garden. I stammered something unintelligible, took a few more notes, and then rushed back to the safety of my Jerusalem home. Trembling I was, with a strange mixture of shame for having asked stupid questions and awe at the answers I got without asking for them. I was often in the crowds who followed him after that, watching from a distance, listening, hearing, checking with people who'd been healed, talking to the woman whose son had been raised from the dead. One day, he was beside a small, unwalled village where scores of peasants were begging him to perform healings. Suddenly, an older woman towed an even older man toward him through the crowd. Jesus noticed that the man was blind, held up his hand to keep everyone at a distance, and then took the man off to a more private place. I watched, close as I could get. Jesus spit directly into the man's eyes. Now, the saliva of a holy one is powerful medicine. And if applied directly, that would be the greatest powerful medicine around. But when Jesus asked the man if he could see, the man responded like he was confused. And then he said, "Well, yeah, I think so, but everyone looks like they're trees walking around." And that got all of us, including Jesus and the old half-blind man, laughing so hard that we cried. After a few moments, Jesus reached out to the man and then raised his hands and prayed for God to bless so that the man would receive full sight. Just like that, everything changed. The man could see clearly. He blinked his new eyes and began to dance and sing and jump and laugh. And the rest of us, we just all joined in, and it was a joyful dance, a glorious day, a thrilling divine party. Being with Jesus was a joyful time. There was another day. He was in a village market when a crowd of young boys who were playing hide and seek rushed around him. In a second, he joined the game and disappeared beneath a cart stacked high with beautiful red apples. They found him, pulled him out, and made him it for the next game, a position he took to with great eagerness. It seemed that half the day was spent playing child games while the village elders looked on. It was so funny, with disdain. No Messiah would waste time with hide and seek, one proud man whispered loudly. That stopped Jesus. just as he was winning a game of marbles. The only way you'll ever make it to heaven, this Messiah declared, is to become like these kids. Laughter, play, health, happiness, children, mothers, joy, forgiveness. These filled his days. Ministry, I heard him tell one of his disciples, happens best when you're smiling. Boo! That, of course, made the starch old lawyers split their seams with disgust. It was beautiful. Oh, those days near Jesus, they gave me hope. When he raised Lazarus from the dead, one of the craziest things I've ever seen happen. There were all kinds of journalists there because it had been told wide. Jesus is coming to see his best friend Lazarus who has died. And so everyone gathered around the tomb, including Mary, Martha, Simon, journalists from every agency you could imagine. And when Jesus talked to Martha, and Martha said, he's dead, he's gone, Jesus cried. Now, amazing. I didn't see him cry much at all. I saw him laugh. I saw him clap people on the back with joy. I saw him angry at people in the court of the temple. I saw him exhausted. I saw him enjoy good food. But I'd never seen him cry. And I started to reach for my notepad to write it down. Jesus cried. The next day in all of the news, the one thing that was at the top of every heading was, he wept. Jesus wept. It was so different. It was news. This is the man who knew how to laugh. And he also taught us that it's okay to cry. All the time I spent near Jesus, what I got was hope. No, this man would never overthrow Rome as everyone wanted the Messiah to do. But he sure was making the world a happier place. When he raised Lazarus from the dead, everyone danced for joy. He attended a feast with Simon, a leprous, old, sexually abusing Pharisee, and allowed a prostitute to drench him with spikenard and then wash his feet with her hair. One day he rode an unbroken donkey from Bethany to Jerusalem. That was hardly a week ago. And there were a mob of revelers waving palm branches while singing songs of rebellion and victory. And then he disappeared into the temple, they say. But now, Sabbath, the singers are all silent. The Messiah is dead, lying in the sepulchre of Arimathea. 100 bored Romans camped outside the sealed door. I wonder if by plan he is resting before taking up his life again on the third day. Wait, is that spikenard I smell? Go ahead. Drive the nails in my hands. Laugh at me where you stand. Go ahead. Say it isn't me. But the day will come when you will see. Because I'll rise again. Ain't no power on earth could tie me down. Yes, I'll rise again. Death can't keep me in the ground. I can hardly wait for tomorrow. Jerusalem has been strangely silent today. Even though Passover has ended and 1 million people should be returning to their homes, instead, it's as if the entire city is holding its breath, waiting to see what might happen next. My day began with an early, urgent pounding on my door, like a legion of Romans demanding entrance. My servant opened the door and accepted a note sealed with the sign of Arimathea. Inside was a hastily scrawled message. Meet me at the tomb, quickly. Body gone, soldiers gone, tomb empty. I grabbed my coat and I ran, my sandals slipping in the morning mud and my heart pounding too fast for an old man. My mind was racing ahead. What might I find? How could the tomb be empty? Did the disciples steal the body in the night? Did the priests tunnel through the stones and steal the body themselves? Did the Romans steal the body? Or did he rise from the dead? At that thought, my feet ceased running. I stood, fixed to the street beside an open bakery, the smell of fresh bread brightening my senses. Of course the tomb was empty. Hadn't he said that he would rise again on the third day? Hadn't he invoked the sign of Jonah? Hadn't he gone to the cross, certain of his resurrection? Of course the tomb was empty. I ran anyway, but now out of excitement rather than fear, eager to meet Joseph, tell him about what I had discovered about Jesus, the King of the Jews, the Son of God, the real, genuine, only true, real Messiah. I ran, shouting for the universe to hear. He's alive! He's alive! He's alive, and I'm forgiven. Heaven's gates are open wide. He's alive! I was hoarse from shouting when I arrived at the sepulchre of Arimathea. No one was there. The seal had been broken. The stone rolled away. The soldier's breakfast was still simmering on the grill. And there were footprints coming and going in the clay before the doorway. I followed the footprints to where Joseph and I had laid him Friday evening. Carefully, tentatively, wondering what had happened here. Inside, all was quiet, though I noticed the sounds of singing birds and smelled the fragrance of spikenard. It had not brought a light, but the morning sun reflected into the recesses of the grave. I chuckled at how death could not dim the light of God's sun. 3 steps in, turn right, 4 steps to the stone table that had been carved for Joseph, but given to Jesus. I stopped, placed my hand on the slab in wonder. Oh yes, there was no body. I had not expected to feel one, but still, he should have been here. A shredded human form, sleeping deeply while awaiting the final resurrection. However, there was no body. The slab was empty. Well, mostly empty. At the end of the stone table, where we had placed his head, there was a small stack of carefully folded linen cloths, the same ones that the old woman had given me, the same that Joseph and I had used to hold the body and spices in a temporary death wrap. Each of the cloths folded perfectly, like my mama taught me to fold my own bedclothes. For a second or two, my mind took me to that rough carpenter's hut in Nazareth, the place where Mother Mary taught young Jesus how to fold his sleeping blankets every morning. I must tell you, tears, uncontrolled, began to course down my cheeks as I thought of his mother weeping at the foot of his cross, probably still weeping now, hiding somewhere in Jerusalem. There was nothing more, just the all-pervasive smell of spikenard. But the spices were gone. Gone. I looked. All 75 pounds of myrrh, aloes, and spikenard were missing. Gone. Even the bag into which the mortician had placed them, even it was gone. There was nothing left except the folded linen and the fragrance of new life, royal life. I stumbled back into the light and stood waiting for Joseph. Instead, I met Mary and Mary and Mary and Martha. And finally, John and Simon and most of the rest of the disciples. They came individually, as if fearful for the soldiers to return, as if certain that if the Jews would find them, they would be upon them with clubs, especially if they spoke above a whisper. I just listened. I listened to the stories and spoke little. The tales were stitched tight with fearful memories and colored with uncertain hopes. Mary told me of begging the gardener to tell her where the body had been taken. She shook as she told me the story, and I wasn't sure what the emotion really was. She told of the fearful early morning dash to the tomb, finding the door rolled away and the tomb empty, bumping into the gardener and then hearing her own name spoken in the voice she had so come to love. Mary? Then she wept, sobs of unspeakable joy. He's alive. She glowed with certainty. John and Peter's stories were similar, but different. John told me of the angels sitting on the stone slab and of the folded linen cloths. Simon spoke of Mary coming to his door, terrified because of what she had found, of racing John to the tomb, and of being found in the garden by Jesus. Simon Peter wouldn't say anything more about that morning. He just cried, sobbing the joy of a healed heart. Later, in a small room at his house, Joseph and I talked. I used his scrolls and reread the words I had found in the prophets. 3 days, Joseph laughed. Just think, God in my tomb. I gave him the stone slab and he gave it back. Oh. Several hours in the quiet this evening, I've been home thinking about Jesus, reviewing everything I've heard him say, every healing I've watched him do, his quick laughter, his love for children, his creative solutions for every problem. Only Jesus would put the tax money in the mouth of a fish. The taste of fresh bread, I remember well. God made bread on a very busy hillside. But I keep coming back to one story. A tale he told one afternoon to a crowd infiltrated with spies, unbelievers, and hostile priests. There once was a man, he began, the father of 2 sons. We listened at full attention as Jesus described the father who loved his son so much that he allowed one to pretend father was dead, demand his inheritance, change his name, travel to a far country, live as a selfish fool, squander everything, and end up as a starving piggard. Should have followed the law and killed him, one scribe judged. Yeah, or same with the debt collectors. They could kill him, voiced another in authority. Let him be gone and forgotten, spoke a local village elder. Hope he died there. That was the consensus. But Jesus wasn't finished. The story has another chapter, Jesus said. While feeding the pigs, the Spirit of God moved in his heart, and the lost son began to think of home, of the longing look his father had given him as he left, of his old soft bed with the warm blankets, of how even the servants got to enjoy his mother's good cooking. Around me, starched listeners struggled uncomfortably in their tight legal opinions. And the boy decided to return home. Yeah, the way that son lived, he'll be a perfect target for the stoning stones, the rabbi pronounced. Boy ought to stay away. If he comes home, he better be ready to die. Jesus just ignored them all. but continued to tell the story of the father who loved his sinner son. The boy left the pigs and began to walk home. With every step, he rehearsed what he would say to his father, how he would beg to be given a place among the servants, not anything more. I don't need to be a son, but I would hope for just a few crumbs. Somehow, Jesus' farmer father knew the change of heart in his son and began watching for him at the city gates, hand shielding his eyes from the sun, hope stirring in his heart, soul urging his son toward home. Come. The listeners grunted their disapproval. And a couple of the village elders, they even reached for the stoning stones they kept in a ready pile before the city gate. One day, the sun came up over the distant hill, said Jesus, feet torn and bloody, clothes little more than threads, eyes and heart brimming with hope, soul pleading for forgiveness. At that point, one of the elders began tossing his stone up and down, as if preparing to give justice a throw. Jesus ignored him, continued. When the father saw his son afar off, he lifted the edges of his robe and sprinted toward his boy, an old man breaking the laws of propriety as he raced to get between his sons and the stones he had earned. If any of the elders had thrown one of the stoning stones, he would have hit the forgiving father rather than the sinner's son. Jesus ended. There were gasps in the crowd, and many mothers reached for their Kleenex. When father reached his son, he embraced him, filthy and smelly though he was. And as the boy began his confession, well rehearsed and broken, father shushed him, hugging him even more tightly. And then father removed his own coat, pulled it around the shoulders of his boy, and pulled the family ring from his finger and slipped it onto the finger of his son. Tears flowing freely, father called to a servant, "Race home! Tell mama to prepare the feast. Our son has come home." Like others in the audience that day, I was personally offended by the free forgiveness given by the father. I may even have whispered that the son should have gotten what he deserved that day. Today, I finally understood. Jesus told that story for me so that I would see how my own forgiveness is free and know that the Father will sacrifice all to assure a place for me in his home. Oh, my Jesus is truly about grace, forgiveness, love, and joy. Unspeakable joy. Once again, he turned my world upside down, just like that night in the garden. Nick, the carpenter Messiah, reached out and placed his hand on my shoulder. My dad loves you so much. One day we were sitting together in heaven looking down, and he said, "Isn't that Nicodemus?" Sure enough. Oh, I love that guy. Son, would you be willing to go down, find him, answer all of his questions, hold him close, bring him home? So rather than dying down there, Nicodemus can live with us in our home forever. That's my story. 3 days of the Passover with the Christ. Oh, and the spices? The spikenard? The fragrance of royalty and new life? I believe Jesus accepted my gift, wrapped it in love, and made sure it got home with him. One day, when I arrive at my home in their home, I have a feeling that Jesus will say, "Nick, I need to show you something." And I'm not sure where he will take me. Maybe to a museum of love. I don't know. But when I get there, he's going to say, "You smell anything?" Ah, yes.
the fragrance of royalty, the promise of new birth. Go ahead. Say I'm dead and gone, but you will see that you were wrong. Go ahead. Try to hide the sun, but all will see that I'm the one, 'cause I'll come again. Ain't no power on earth can keep me back. Yes, I'll come again. Come to take my people